Thanks very much, Patricia, and thanks to all of you. It's a pleasure to talk with you today and to participate in this really, really interesting panel. I think that the discussion earlier about the legal environment really, and then moving to talk about specific transactions, it allows us to talk across the spectrum from the very sophisticated public-private partnerships that have been done in really developed economies to the more sort of frontier kinds of adaptive public-private partnerships that are being done through some of our work in IFC and in the World Bank. And I'm going to talk with you a little bit about one of the projects I've worked on over the last few years. But I'd like to give you a background first in what it is exactly that IFC does specifically and how we fit into what the World Bank does in terms of the World Bank Group does in terms of public-private partnerships. And don't worry, this is also setting the stage a little bit for my colleague Jane Jameson, who's coming a bit later. So we all work for the same group and we do the same sort of thing. So we are a lead PPP advisor to governments. I sometimes describe us as a PPP unit. We're all procurement experts and we have global experience in public-private partnerships, and we start really from the very beginning when governments are just considering using public-private partnerships and how they would use public-private partnerships. We work with them through project selection, pre-feasibility, feasibility, all the way through the tender documentation and through to commercial and financial close. We work very carefully and closely with our bank colleagues from just in the sense of preparing a country assistance strategy, for example, when governments are just beginning to consider these things, and over quite a period of years. Mark Mosley mentioned earlier, sometimes it takes several years to structure these projects. Well, it takes maybe even a few years before that for governments to get ready to do these things and to put various things in place. So we actually work across all areas, not only in traditional infrastructure, but also in the areas of road transport, water, sanitation, and power, whatever. Also into newer areas such as social infrastructure, which includes hospitals, healthcare facilities of all different ranges, and into education as well. Excuse me one second. Sorry, I'm just getting over the flu, and I'm not going to make it if I have a glass of water with me. So we're all transaction specialists in this PPP advisory services group at IFC. Our transactions, we're not here to replace consulting firms or other financial institutions that provide advice in public sector, public-private partnerships. We're really here to help governments do sort of the first, most difficult, pioneering kinds of transactions. We emphasize really access to basic services and the provision of public services, especially to the poor. So we undertake transactions that are really, by definition, much more difficult than traditional sort of market PPPs that you might see in developing countries. We have quite a long track record of assignments and successful projects in over 84 countries. I work mostly for the last more than 6 years now in sub-Saharan Africa, but I worked in many different countries in many different regions. And we have a special emphasis on our work in sub-Saharan Africa, where we've been particularly active. So clients, as with many of the bank group services, clients actually pay IFC for the services. This is not on a full cost recovery basis, but it does indicate commitment to the project. And then we're also paid by the private sector, our success fee at the end. And we're not paid our success fee until the project actually reaches financial close, which is very important. Another important aspect of our work is that we often bring a lot of other elements. You've talked in earlier presentations about what makes a project successful. And part of it is the government's capacity for understanding the project, proper regulation of the project, and then also contract management and the ability to carry throughout the length of the PPP agreement, which can be quite long in some cases. So we bring, as we're structuring the project, we bring capacity building elements to our work, along with other colleagues, maybe in PIAF or different parts of the bank group. And so we're able to help to build government's capacity all along to make a more successful transaction. And we stay with them after financial close sometimes, even if that's necessary for several years, to help them continue with implementation. So, yeah. I'm just going to skip right now to discuss the two hospitals that we've recently completed the commercial close for in Alexandria, Egypt. And these are two greenfield hospitals. One's a maternity hospital, and the other one is a neurology hospital. In Egypt, there's, in essence, sort of universal coverage. So patients are not paying here for the services. Government is paying an availability payment for these new hospitals. They used the PFI model here, which is, as we know, very well characterized in the UK primarily, where there are facilities and then facilities management afterwards. And it's very important from the government side to be able to provide the clinical services, which is different to some of our other projects, which include the clinical services. So the PPP unit, one of the elements of this project that makes it so interesting, Mr. Dio was talking earlier about how things need to be adapted for the context of a project. And the PPP unit that was in place in Egypt was, which is very active, was very much at the forefront of pushing PPPs forward. And they chose 5 key areas, including health, but they also looked at water and sanitation, power, and transport. Then in the health projects, they were very forward-thinking and really moved very aggressively with 2 projects at the same time. So at the same time, this was tendered under the old procurement law, which, as you can imagine, we all know Egypt is undergoing quite a bit of transition due to the revolution and also to the sort of non-resolution as of now of many political aspects. And what's happened is we started with a very very forward-thinking and very fast-moving PPP program in Egypt, which has achieved some measure of success, but at the same time, the risk-taking that they put in place to move forward with these projects has been curtailed quite a bit by the context in the environment. The PPP legislation that was put in place was not passed as quickly as they had hoped, and we tendered under the old procurement law, which was quite restrictive in a lot of ways. So what we were faced with was using the output-based approach for these projects under the existing procurement law, which is really only designed for goods and not even so much for services, and then trying to get the university's needs met through this project under the old law. So throughout the project, which has gone on now for almost 5 years, we experienced actually a narrowing of possibilities due to the change in the context around us, even though there were risk takers in place in the beginning of the project and a lot of political support. So one of the other areas that was highlighted earlier was that there's a lot of interest from a variety of investors for these projects. You get a lot of international investors, but at the same time, under the circumstances that we experienced, in the very beginning of the project, sort of the first phase here, the analysis up to transaction structure and marketing to investors, we had a lot of interest from very active international participants and they were really promoting and feeding government's interest in doing a very sort of cutting-edge transaction for the market. But as the circumstances began to change in Egypt and the market began to slow down, what happened was, as we started to prepare the contract and then to get into the tender process, we had regional and local investors who started to take the lead because they were the ones who were really comfortable in the context. And going back to one of the earlier session, we went from a very aggressive open market to a more closed market where we really were only going to have local and regional investors. We have strong international participation, but not as the leads in the bidding consortiums, which is a change, but one that we're becoming much more comfortable with at IFC. It's something we see a lot of. Interestingly enough, there were no credit enhancements required for this project, and we're actually finding that quite a lot in Africa because with the use of local and regional investors, they're more comfortable with the circumstances that we find, and so they're not needing the credit enhancements, which international investors feel much more bound to. So I think I'll just quickly stop with the lessons learned. Really, from a legal perspective, context is not static. And it always really matters. The legal, political, economic, and market environments are all interrelated, and they provide a context that really you can't ignore, and you must always be very flexible and very responsive to that throughout the PPP procurement process. That's really critical. And we've had to really work with our clients and work with investors to understand what is doable with the market as it changes. And I think there's, of course, a great strength in governments that are willing to go forward and willing to test the limits. But it has to be done at the right time, and it has to be done rapidly to take advantage of whatever window is there. I've talked a bit about the regional investors, and I think that's really important, and we emphasize that really a lot now because market conditions are just not as strong as they have been, and the regional and local investors putting together these consortia that have parties who understand the risks and are willing to take the risks. This is really important, and we encourage that very strongly and work quite closely with our clients to make sure that that happens. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that the markets need good deals, and every market, there are people looking for deals and looking to do business. And so even though things appear very difficult, I think you'll find these sorts of investors no matter what, as long as the deals are structured in a way that reflects the current context and reflects protections for the investors and for government. Thank you.